Hello and welcome to another Healthy Bite. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Well, this week we had the pleasure of talking to Dr. Sandeep Gupta, and Sandeep is practicing in southern Queensland, on the Gold Coast, and he is a holistic, integrative medical practitioner, and I just so enjoyed talking to him. We covered so many interesting topics, and I really felt that this week's Healthy Bite was an opportunity to reflect on that and reinforce some of the things and what I found, because there were so many notes and so many great aspects to it. I mean, as a holistic practitioner myself for over 40 years now, to hear Sandeep's approach to holistic medicine was a real inspiration to me. And one of the things that really inspired me was how he screens patients. You see, when people come to see a practitioner, it's an opportunity for that practitioner to begin a process of education and also to set an agenda. And so Sandeep actually does this screening test, which I thought was really important. And it's an important thing to share with you and ask yourself this question next time you go to see your holistic practitioner or even just your doctor. And is that these are really important questions, because there are two ways of approaching healthcare. One is to manage chronic disease, and the other is to make changes to overcome those diseases, to build resilience, and to enjoy good health. What a wonderful idea. So Sandeep asks his patients a series of questions before they even start, and that is, are you open to the following? Are you open to changing your diet? Are you open to taking supplements if necessary? Are you open to making changes to your lifestyle, exploring how emotions may be impacting your health, exploring your home or work environment for potential triggers, incorporating exercise in your life, and are you open to follow-ups, to come back and review and check? Because this is not a one-off thing. It's a journey. It's called life. And making the most of it, if in his practice, because he is such a busy practitioner, in fact, he's closed his books to new patients, although his practice is made up of several practitioners, all of which practice in a similar way to him. So Sandeep feels that these are really important questions to ask before embarking on a journey with the patient, because so often we people approach health practitioners to solve problems, and that's fine in an acute stage. If something is a problem, if you're suffering from an acute problem that is causing an issue, then that needs to be fixed. And we are very, very fortunate to have a Western medical health model that is there, and it does that extremely well. If you've just had a heart attack, this is no time for the ambulance to come and ask you these questions and start talking about lifestyle changes. If you've broken a limb or been involved in an accident or some serious illness has confronted you, well, you need to bring that under control. And Western medicine is a great place. Thank goodness we have so many brilliant practitioners doing just that. I know myself, I have been in quite a bit of pain in recent months with a hip problem, which was just getting progressively worse, despite the fact that I'd done acupuncture, massage, changed my diet. Well, not changed my diet, tried to go on to an even more low-inflammatory diet, avoided alcohol, I did everything. And at the end of the day, I needed a hip replacement, and I am incredibly grateful for the skill and knowledge of my orthopedic surgeon who did that, and turned a pain level of around 8 or 9 out of 10, which had been going on for several months, to about a 0 out of 10. So that's what Western medicine is good for. But when we get into the epidemic of chronic diseases which we face in our community, remembering that cardiovascular disease is the biggest killer, kills about 18 million people a year globally. And because we're so used to hearing daily death rates, it may be sobering to know that 50,000 people a year die of cardiovascular disease. Cancer comes in at number 2, which is around 10 million people, which equates to around 27,000 people a day die each day globally from cancer. Diabetes, about 10 million people, about 4.5 million people die from that, which equates to about 10,000 people a day. So anyway, these statistics are quite staggering, and I think the point being that these chronic diseases are at epidemic proportions. They're preventable, they're treatable, they're reversible in many instances, but you need to be on that journey with your practitioner. So that's a great screening thing. His whole approach to history taking is another important one. And so often if you ask your patients the right questions, I've always found, and I've learnt this from one of my mentors that mentored me over 35 years ago, she said that if you ask your patients the right questions, often they'll not only tell you what's wrong with them, but they'll tell you how to fix it. And that was another interesting aspect to our conversation with Sandeep, because so much of his consultation he says his initial consultation is 1 to 2 hours. And the initial part of that is to listen to your patient, to listen to the patient. And that's a form of validation. So often people visit their doctor, and because the doctor doesn't really know what the problem is, we'll say to them either there's nothing wrong with you, they'll have done tests. Chronic pain is an excellent example of this. People who have suffered from chronic musculoskeletal pain like headaches, neck aches, jaw aches, back aches, will have been to x-rays, MRIs, have neurological tests, and the doctor will say to them, well, really, I just don't think there's anything wrong with you. And there is the patient in pain. Is it really important to listen to our patients? And Sandeep made a really interesting point, and he said that in a very small percentage of cases, and we agreed that was probably like 1 or 2%, this is a psychotic episode of psychological whatever, but in 99% of cases, a patient's problems are real, and they need to be listened to, and that is a form of validation and a really important part of the healing process. And so often we do hear from practitioners have said, oh, there's nothing wrong with you, it's all good. Whereas the practitioner really should have said, I really don't know what is wrong with you. Another common statement that so-called health experts make is when someone asks them about nutritional or environmental issues, they will be very quickly say, oh, there's no evidence to support that. Whereas again, what they should have said, if they were being truly honest, was that they haven't read the evidence to support it. And there's the world of difference in those two responses. So the next time you hear a health expert say there's no evidence to support that, take that with a grain of salt. Interesting, we're going to do a whole program on salt, but take that with a grain of salt, because to stay up to date on medical research requires something like 600 hours of reading a week. There are only, I think, 128 hours in the week, so that's just not going to happen. And it needs to be across a lot of disciplines. So this is what a holistic approach is. And yet so often so-called experts will dismiss any suggestion that there's something they don't know as being irrelevant is important. And this is what struck me about my conversation with Sandeep, a guy that is so knowledgeable and yet humble as well, willing to admit that there are things he doesn't know, and he will say to a patient, I don't know that, but I will find out about it. So I thought that was really interesting aspect of our chat, and I'd really recommend that you go back and listen to it. It was an absolute cracker. We also covered actually integrative cardiology, something that he is passionate about, and I thought that was so interesting again because many of you will have heard, I hope, the visit with integrative cardiologist Dr. Ross Walker, who is a good friend of mine, my own cardiologist, and I love to get Ross on about once a year for us all to have a heart check. But it was so interesting to hear Sandeep's approach, again reinforcing that family history was an important one. and reminding us that when it comes to cardiovascular disease, like almost every other disease, in fact, there are two drivers which we all need to be really focused on. One of them is inflammation, and the other one is insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance, when it goes out of control, leads to type 2 diabetes. But there are subclinical aspects of insulin resistance, and you may have heard it before, but insulin is a way of regulating glucose within the body, and carbohydrates get broken down very quickly to glucose. So you don't just have to eat sugar. Carbohydrates also break down quickly to be glucose. And if you are insulin resistant, it means that you have too much glucose floating around in your body. How much glucose should or is there ideally floating around in your body? 4 to 8 grams at any one time. Now, 1 teaspoon of sugar is 4 grams of sugar. 1 teaspoon is 4 grams. So that gives you an idea that there's not a lot of glucose floating around in the body. And the reason is that glucose is used for energy, but it also fuels inflammation. If you have too much glucose floating around in your body, then you will be fueling inflammation. And that's a bit like likening it to bushfires. You know, if there is no dry kindling underneath trees and to stoke the fire, then you're unlikely to get a bushfire that goes out of control. But if you have too much glucose floating around in your body, then the fire of inflammation will be burning and predisposing you to cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, a whole range of autoimmune conditions, and just not being at your best. So that was so interesting. And the other interesting thing we discussed was endothelial lining dysfunction. Now, endothelial cells are lining the inner surface of blood vessels, and they form a single layer of cells called endothelium, which controls the exchange of materials between blood and tissues. So there's this thin layer of cell called the endothelium, which now when these endothelial cells become damaged, this can lead to the development of vessel diseases. Endothelial diseases are characterized by reduced nitric oxide, and we talk about nitric oxide as well. And this is a subject, when we talk about nitric oxide, it is really one of the body's most important regulators. It's an important vasodilator, meaning the blood vessels relax, bronchodilator, meaning the airways relax, and importantly, it's also antimicrobial, and that includes antiviral. So endothelial lining dysfunction is an important driver of cardiovascular disease, but hey, guess what? Endothelial lining is in the respiratory system and the digestive system, so there are common denominators that run through the whole body. And Sandeep was talking about the importance of nitric oxide. We talked a bit about how, well, diet is obviously a driver of nitric oxide. So, this is why vegetables are often said to be useful in terms of their health because of their ability to produce nitric oxide, within meat as well. But also breathing well forms nitric oxide. To regular listeners, you will know that we are championing nasal breathing, not mouth breathing, and the reason for that is that it warm, humidifies and filters the air, something we cover in a up-and-coming podcast with Professor Pete Smith in allergies. But also it is where if you breathe through your nose, 60% of the body's nitric oxide is produced in the nasal and paranasal sinuses only when you breathe through your nose. So this is part of the filtration system. And boy, is an antimicrobial filtration system important in this day and age, always has been actually, but even more important now. We touch on methylation. Now, many of you may have heard the word methylation, but basically it's a way of making compounds more available for your body to use. It's a really important process that goes on in the biochemistry of the body called methylation. And some of us, including myself, have a gene that that predisposes me to poor methylation, which means I probably should never be drinking alcohol, and which means that even though I'm out in the sun, my vitamin D levels have never been as high as they should be, and that's partly because of methylation. Now, you may recall an episode we did with Dr. Carolyn Dean on magnesium, and magnesium is also a very important part of vitamin D production. He talked about, again, we're talking about integrative cardiology here, remember, and sleep comes back again as being an important factor, which a consistently good night's sleep is so important on absolutely every part of your physical and mental well-being. And then we talk about vitamin D, K2 and E. Now, these are fat-soluble supplements, and again, Sandeep said something which was just so aha. And I've heard this before, but it just bears repeating. And this is why it doesn't matter that we may repeat things, because revision is a good thing in healthcare. Reminding us of how it all ties together is so important. Fat-soluble vitamins are so important. A, D, E, and K. Why? Because fat is such an important component of every cell and hormone in our body. And endothelial cells, remember we said endothelial lining dysfunction? Well, fat-soluble vitamins ensure that dysfunction is minimal. And it's interesting also to discuss vitamin D for a moment, because I just had a blood test done, and the reference range for optimal vitamin D level is 50 to 140 nanomoles per milliliter, or whatever the measure is. But it's the figure is more important than the unit, and that is 50 to 140. So if you've got a vitamin D level of 52, your doctor will look at that and go, you're fine. Vitamin D levels, you're still within the normal range. Well, the normal range may not be the healthy range, particularly when you consider that at least 50% of the population has one comorbidity. So if that is the normal average range, then perhaps we could be saying that the population who has 50% comorbidities have low vitamin D levels. His optimal levels is 125 to 155, and I've often heard it said that if you have cancer, that is definitely the optimal range that you should be in, and I have, and that's something I am still working towards. So that's important. And he also mentioned the importance of CoQ10, ubiquinol. Now, there are two forms of CoQ10, ubiquinone, and there's an enzyme in our body which converts ubiquinone to ubiquinol. However, as we get older, that doesn't happen as well. So taking a supplement of ubiquinol is important. We did a terrific program just on that with Gerald Quigley, integrative pharmacist. So we also talked about lipoprotein little a, which we went into with Ross Walker as well. So I'd recommend you go back and have a listen to not just Sandeep's podcast, but Ross Walker's as well. Then we touched on something which he is possibly, well, unquestionably, I think, one of Australia's leading experts on, and that is mould. And that is, if you're in Australia, M-O-U-L-D, but if you're an American, M-O-L-D. But anyway, mould. And as we watched houses in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland recently being inundated, and I'm not just talking about the carpet getting wet, I am talking about two-story buildings being covered with water almost up to the tip of the roof. People having to scurry onto their roofs to be saved. Now, that is just such a nightmare, and I feel for those people hugely. I mean, just the whole destruction to the house. But then it raises issues about the effect of dampness. And we had a program recently with the legendary Nicole Bilgema, whose book is over my, I think, left shoulder now. You might notice the room's been rearranged. Healthy Homes, Healthy Buildings. And she's a building biologist. And she talked to us about the effect of damp in houses. And that comes from even just the simple blocking off of air vents, sealing off of doors to be energy efficient. The problem is we as humans produce a lot of moisture through our breath, through our cooking, through our living, and it gets locked into our houses and dries out. So whether you've been inundated with a flood, catastrophic flood or not, damp in the house or any water damage that gets under the carpets or into gyprock is a serious problem which could be affecting your health. It often is completely ignored or undiagnosed. So this is a huge and growing problem, and the potential debilitating effects of these are so surprising, so often ignored and so often undiagnosed. And we also did a great program with Amy Skilton, who is a naturopath and a great educator. And she herself, a woman in her, I think Amy is at the time was in her 30s. Amy is a vibrant, healthy-looking woman, I can tell you, but this reduced her to barely being able, well, not even being able to get out of bed. And it wasn't until she herself discovered that there was a minor leak in her bathroom, which got under the carpet and then caused mold, which wiped her out for almost a whole year of her life until she got on top of it. So it's worth mentioning again that Sandeep and Nicole Bilgema run a wonderful course for patients, which and practitioners, is on my list of so many courses to do, called moldillnessmadesimple.com. And that's mold spelled M-O-L-D. Mold Illness Made Simple, all one word, lowercase.com. Now, then we also, on that episode, and I'm going to do a separate healthy bite on this one, COVID. Yes, we tucked a discussion of COVID in there at the end of an episode. God forbid we should be seen as terribly subversive, talking about early treatment and prevention, my God. Now, to any regular listener, you will know my view on how we have approached COVID, and I think I'm up to the 10 Ps of COVID. They are, what are we? Profit, politics, power, patents, very important word that, patents. We're going to do a whole program on that soon. Peer pressure, psychosis, and you could argue about in which order you put those, but I've probably missed a P out, but there is no arguing, in my opinion, what the last P on that list is, and that is, sadly, public health. Now, interestingly, Sandeep and I discussed Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh is a state in India which had a COVID response in 2020. Now, Uttar Pradesh has a population of 240 or 50 million people, which means it is in total about half the size of Europe and about 2/3 the size of the United States. And many of you may remember that the Delta variant was initially appeared in India. Now, to anybody that has seen a photo of any Indian street scene, you will know that social distancing is not something that occurs in India. So here we have the Delta variant in a place where social distancing was well near impossible, and you would have expected that this came about this is where the Delta variant emerged. You would have thought that literally millions of people would have died. And in the same way that we saw scenes in our news of China, Wuhan, in the early days, where literally there were images on the screen of people dropping down in the street and being covered and dying. Or we saw parks set up as hospitals and morgues in America and in Italy, right? So it's not hard, if there is a disaster, for Western media to be there, photograph it and report it. And if there was the potential for a marketing exercise for Big Pharma to promote vaccinations, you would have thought that a human catastrophe in a place like India would have been very easy to go and photograph and to scare the hell out of a Western civilization. We never saw that. And why did we never see that? Well, because Uttar Pradesh issued kits to their population. And what were those kits? They were a pulse oximeter, a digital thermometer, vitamin C tablets, multivitamin tablets with including zinc, vitamin D3, ivermectin, doxycycline, which is a very cheap antibiotic which has been used for 30 or 40 years for respiratory infections. They were the kits that were provided. Now, I'm going to be doing a whole program on the Australian Government COVID Treatment Forum, which occurred just recently in April 2022. It was a 2-hour summit, a forum. I forced myself to sit through it, and we are going to be doing a whole program on it. Stay tuned for that. But suffice to say, and I'll give you a little bit of a clue about what I discuss in that. There was a recent article in the British Medical Journal called The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine. And in that article, the British Medical Journal, one of the most respected, the oldest and most respected medical journals in the world, identified 2 terms that we should all be very familiar with. They are key opinion leaders and product champions. And I'm going to give you a hint. The Australian COVID Treatment Forum, which said, this is 26 months after the beginning of the pandemic in Australia, said it is now time to protect those at risk and to implement strategies for early treatment. And I sat through the head of the department, health department, Australia's chief medical officer, deputy chief medical officer, the director of the Therapeutic Goods Association, the secretary of the Australian Health Department. These are all people and names that you will be familiar with if you're in Australia. They spent 2 hours talking about not one of these things that Uttar Pradesh, or Goa is another state in India that provided kits for their population. Not one mention of any of those things. No, it was a 2-hour forum for key opinion leaders and product champions to discuss the newly patented drugs, which instead of, let me give you an example, a 5-day course of ivermectin. So if you came down with COVID, a 5-day course of ivermectin would cost you something like $2.50, a 5-day course. A 5-day course of molnupiravir, which is the newly patented drug by the same manufacturer as ivermectin, by the way. And remember, ivermectin was awarded a Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2015. Merck were the producers, but you may have, well, my regular listeners will definitely know it not as horse medicine, but the media globally reduced the Nobel Prize-winning medicine to nothing more than horse medicine espoused by right-wing nutters or anti-vaxxers. $2.50 a course. Molnupiravir, $700 for the 5-day course. Paxlovid, which is the Pfizer product, that's around $600 for a 5-day course. And another drug that they talked about was Resdemivir in the Key Opinion Leaders Product Champion Forum from the Australian government. That's $3,000 a course. So there was no mention of any of these. Look, it was such a great episode. I really learnt so much, and I really wanted to share it. I thought it was worth reviewing just that episode and alert your attention to it. Have a listen to it. Have a listen to it more than once. It is well worth it. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.